As I went through and graded the guided rings from last week, there was one issue that I saw that I wanted to be sure to address. It's something that Hamilton talks about, and I want to address it here to bring clarity to it so that there's no misunderstanding about what's going on or what Hamilton might be arguing. And it deals with the first question, what makes Deuteronomy so different than the rest of the Pentateuch. Now, of course, I've addressed this in another video, but I do want to address it specifically here when it has to do, because it's tied with Notes Deuteronomistic history theory, and it's tied to a very foundational, critical issue that's involved with the Pentateuch as a whole. Deuteronomy's difference, I mean, it is different in theme, it's different in structure, it's different in style than the rest of the Pentateuch, and this has led many scholars, Martin Note being the most notable, no pun intended, to argue that Deuteronomy, because it's so different, does not belong as a part of the Pentateuch, that it was actually written differently, it was written at a different time by a different author or authors, and basically it just pretends to be written around the time of Moses, and it was just made up. The classical argument is that it was during Josiah's reforms in the late 6th century, 7th century, that led to the formation and the creation of Deuteronomy, that basically he or some priests or some religious leaders that were associated with him invented Deuteronomy in order to justify his religious reforms that he was placing on the southern kingdom of Judah. A scholar by the name of Deveta originally argued that, and that has held sway for ever since the late 19th century into the even modern day. This is tied with what's called the documentary hypothesis, which Hamilton refers to and talks about a little bit. Since this is an undergrad class, I didn't and don't want to go into a lot of details, but I think that this is an important issue that needs to be addressed. Deuteronomy, though many scholars would say that Deuteronomy does not belong with part of the Pentateuch, it wasn't written by Moses or anyone associated with Moses, it was written much later. I think that it's important for us to say that there's really no specific external or objective evidence to support that theory. There's no reason to separate Deuteronomy from the rest of the Pentateuch. Yes, in style and format, it is different, but it continues to extend the themes that run through the rest of the Pentateuch. These themes of land, seed, and relationship with God, characterized by blessing and curses. This is where everything kind of comes together, and the promise of the land is not necessarily fulfilled, but Deuteronomy focuses on that more than the other books of the Pentateuch do. And so we can see that Deuteronomy does actually have thematic similarity with the Pentateuch, but it is interpretive. It is looking backwards and looking forward. I said in my other video, it's a hinge in the sense that it is of all 5 of the books of the Pentateuch, the one that lends itself most readily to the covenant responsibilities that the people will have in the land that they're going into, or if we want to look backwards, did have. So of course Deuteronomy would be the book that would look different because of its nature, but that doesn't mean that we need to separate it and take it away from the rest of the Pentateuch and form what some scholars have called a tetrateuch, and then attach it to the beginning of the historical books, as Martin Note does. I think Note does bring up some good points about the themes and theologies of the historical books, but I think he's wrong when he separates Deuteronomy from the rest of the Pentateuch. There's a lot that goes into talking the documentary hypothesis. That's tied up into how did the Pentateuch get written. Classically, the authorship of the Pentateuch has been attached to Moses, and I think there's good reason for that, and many scholars since the 19th century have questioned that or just rejected it out of hand. And so I would be remiss if I didn't just spend a couple minutes talking about authorship of the Pentateuch generally, and specifically with Deuteronomy. When we're dealing with authorship of the Pentateuch, we have to understand that the Pentateuch itself makes no claim of authorship. It never says that Moses wrote every word here. It's been a traditional view, the view that was held by the church, held by the Jews during Jesus' time and by the nation before that. But any evidence that scholars point to that say someone other than Moses wrote the book, or that it was written, made up, and all that, is all subjective evidence. It's they're reading their own preconceived notions into the book. There does seem to be some indication that there's material in the Pentateuch that Moses didn't write. For instance, at the end of Deuteronomy, it writes about his death, and it's unlikely that Moses wrote about his own death before he died in the past tense. So it's okay to say someone came along at some point and added that, and maybe added some editorial comments to the work as a whole, which is fine. But Moses, there's good reason to hold to Moses being at least responsible for it. And certainly the book of Deuteronomy purports to be the speeches of Moses, and so we can say that even if it's a scribe writing down what Moses said, it still attributes to Moses. But there's no archaeological data to support the idea that Deuteronomy should be separated from the Pentateuch. There's no textual evidence. There's the earliest tradition we have is of these 5 books together, not 4 books plus Deuteronomy. It's just that if Deuteronomy has a special place in the historical books, it's because it, like I said, of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, lends itself better to that. It seems to be, one scholar has called it almost a constitution, not of the nation of Israel. Now, it's not strictly speaking a constitution, but it does serve as something of a founding and governing, if you want to use the term, document. And so, of course, the theology of Deuteronomy would lend itself well to the historical books, much more so than Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers, in that Deuteronomy is talking about in the land. And so the historical books are saying, while we were in the land, this is what happened, and while we lost it. And, of course, the blessings and curses of chapters 27 and 28 in Deuteronomy lend themselves very well to, if you're on the exile and asking yourself, why are we in exile? Well, that Deuteronomy answers that question. So, of course, the historical books would use Deuteronomy. There's still no reason to separate Deuteronomy from the rest of the Pentateuch or say that Moses had nothing to do with it. To hold to the late date of Deuteronomy, as many historical critical scholars do, would be to say that Deuteronomy is not true, that it's a made-up document. And, of course, we can't accept that, and there's no reason to argue that. It's just basically, if you assume that supernatural events don't happen, if you assume a lot of different things that they assume, and I don't have time to go into them, then of course you're going to come up with this conclusion. But there's really good reason to hold to the traditional view that Moses is at the very least responsible for Deuteronomy, that it was written at the same time as the rest of the Pentateuch, and that it is a part of the Pentateuch and not a separate document that should be separated from it. There's no reason to believe that, and there's actual good reasons to hold to that. And Hamilton actually goes into that argument, so you can look at that, and you can look at some of the footnotes that he has, and see some of his sources, so you can see the argument for it.